Good evening. We would like to welcome you all this evening to this lecture that is sponsored by the History and Archaeology Department with the support of the Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, Chair of Arabic and Islamic Studies, in collaboration with the Center for the Arts and Humanities here at AUB. And we especially would like to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Rana Mikati. In fact, we are welcoming her back home, in essence. Mm-hmm. She is one of ours, not only in terms of being Lebanese and from Beirut, but also from here at AUB. In the introduction to her book, she describes herself as, "I'm a daughter of this city whose ancestors have lived and been buried in its soil for at least 400 years. And so it's great to welcome her back to be with us. Dr. Mikati is an associate professor of Islamic history at the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina. She received her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago after having received her Bachelor of Arts in Archaeology in 2000 here at AUB. We are again happy to have her back at her home institution. She continued merging her history and archaeology interest when she went to the University of Chicago, where she specialized in Islamic archaeology. Dr. Mikati's research focuses on the cultural and intellectual history of the Eastern Mediterranean in the early medieval period, with particular interest in early Islamic frontiers, warfare, and material culture. Her recent book, Creating an Islamic City, Beirut, Jihad, and the Sacred, was published by Brill Publishing in March 2024. She is currently co-authoring a study of the manuscript dealer and publisher Muhammad Amin al-Khanji and the translocation of Islamic manuscripts in the wake of World War I. The title of her lecture this evening is Soldiers, Sailors, Scholars, Life on the Edge of Empire in Early Islamic Beirut. We are very excited to have Dr. Mikati with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. First, thank you, Lyle, if I may, or Professor Armstrong, and thank you to Dr. Al-Fali, who has also invited me here. I wanted to thank also Ms. Basil and Abbas, who have made the logistics of this travel easy and have been very efficient. I also want to thank the audience for making the time to be here tonight. It is really a special moment for me to be back here at the American University of Beirut, where my academic career actually started, and my interest in Beirut and its archaeology, and to talk to a knowledgeable audience about what I've tried to do. As Professor Armstrong mentioned, the talk today is going to be based on the work I've done for the book that came out last year. The book itself is in 3 moments. The first moment deals to a certain extent with the transformation of Beirut from a Byzantine metropolis to an Islamic town, kind of trying to meld the historical and the archaeological. The second part deals with the emergence of a Muslim community around Abdurrahman ibn Amr al-Awzāʿī, so his students, himself, and kind of the school of law that kind of merged around him. And then in the last part, kind of looking back at the creation of a sacred landscape around him. Lieu de mémoire associated with his life and his death around Beirut. Now, for today's talk, I will focus on parts of the first and the second parts of the book. Now, before I get started, I wanted to make sure you all know that this book, although Dr. Armstrong had already kind of alluded to it, that this project, this book, is personal. It's personal on a professional level because, like some of us here in the audience, we, and during our undergraduate years, participated in the excavations of downtown Beirut, and that kind of turned our lives forever. But it's also personal because of familiar connections that I've discovered when it comes to the history of Beirut as I got started looking kind of at the material history. So just kind of to explain quickly what the slide is here. That little plaque here is inside the Umari Mosque, and it's basically a dedication by an ancestor of the Mikati family that kind of did work in the Umari Mosque. The poem that's down below is a poem written by Rana Mikati, and it is in the shrine of al-Awzāʿī. So it's really personal, al-Awzāʿī in Beirut. But it's also experimental, because the history of Beirut in the early Islamic period is really non-existent. And so the information about Beirut is extremely fragmentary, whether it is the archaeological or the historical. And so the question is, what do you get out from these little mentions here and there in the historical records, and then the fragmentary archaeological material, both sets of sources that answer different questions and put them together to create a coherent narrative. So this is the challenge for me, and hopefully I've succeeded at least partially. Also, I felt that it is needed as a book. I acknowledge that there has been a lot of works done on the history of Beirut, and I stand on the shoulders of giants, as they say. There's work that's been done on the history of Beirut from a number of perspectives, whether kind of popularizing books or books looking at the more recent Islamic history. However, none of them really focus solely on the early Islamic period, this period of Umayyad and Abbasid Beirut. And they definitely did not have the archaeological evidence available. Now, the other issue that I want to kind of allude to, although it is a bit sensitive, but it needs to be said, is that typically when talking about the history of Beirut or the history of Lebanon, there's a tendency to be interested in the Bronze Age, especially the Iron Age, the Roman, the Byzantine, and then we skip over the early Islamic, go to the Crusader, and then Mamluk, Ottoman, modern. As if suddenly, in the early Islamic period, the country and the town were emptied of their inhabitants and stopped having a history. And so this is kind of the proverbial gap in the literature that I was attempting to fill. Now for today, I'm going to try to move quickly through three themes. Soldiers, that will enable me to talk about the Islamic conquests. And so this is kind of the earliest period. Then sailors, and this is the beginning of the Umayyad navy and Beirut's connection to it. And then in the third moment, in the early Abbasid period, the arrival of Awzāʿī and the creation of a student body around him here in Beirut. Now, before we get to Beirut in the early Islamic period, when the Muslim armies showed up at the gates, Beirut had changed drastically from the famous Byzantine metropolis with the law school. Many of you are familiar with that history, but I thought it's worth reiterating. It was struck by a series of what I refer to as unfortunate events. One of those unfortunate events that's usually not really dealt with when it comes to Beirut specifically, because we don't have the archaeological and the historical material, but that most probably affected Beirut, is the Justinianic plague. So it started in Egypt and moved along in Syria and arrived in Constantinople. And I personally believe, and I would be happy to be corrected, that it most probably affected Beirut as a port city and led to loss of life in the town. And so it kind of started this process where Beirut starts to lose its prosperity and resilience. But unfortunate events, it seems, always come in series. And so the real turning point that is known by everyone and the event that dominates the retelling of the history of Beirut is the great earthquake of 551. July 9th, 551, a big quake hit Beirut, and it had catastrophic events on the city. And archaeological excavations have, as we know now, shown the effects of the earthquake everywhere in town. And here I'm just I put that picture because I was kind of involved. This is from the Beirut Souks excavations, where currently, you have Zara and the shopping center. And basically, the area was occupied by villas and shops that were really the places for the rich and famous to hang out, maybe. And so when it was struck with the earthquake, the area was destroyed. There's evidence of cracked thresholds, destruction layers, a Byzantine coin hoard, etc., but also that polycandelon that's fallen on the ground, never picked up again. And so that's also, for me, what's interesting about this evidence is that while there are parts of Beirut that were reconstructed, thanks to the efforts of the locals and the fact that Justinian sent, a representative to help with the reconstruction, but a lot of Beirut, or parts of Beirut, let's say, remained damaged. And so the town wasn't its old self, especially that two of its main economic engines, the law school and the port, most probably, the law school we know ceased to exist, and the port were damaged. And I want you to imagine the law school is drawing in students, it's a source of income, it's a source of prestige, and that disappears. Similarly, Beirut was a trade town, and the port affect, the loss of the functionality of the port affected that. And it doesn't end there. The beginning of the 7th century is also marked by turmoil. There's political legitimacy issues. The Emperor Maurice is murdered. Riots spring out throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and possibly also in Beirut. There are riots in 608, 609. Then this is closely followed and partially causes the Sasanian conquests. And so here, for example, the presence of the Sasanians in Beirut is a terra incognita. We don't really know anything about their presence and rule here. There is one area, one excavation, I think by the Lebanese University, where they connect certain ash layers to the Sasanian conquest. But honestly, archaeologists know that connecting one burn layer in one place to a conquest event is a really murky affair. In any case, Beirut at the beginning of the 7th century had transformed from a metropolis to a small town by the Mediterranean. So when the Muslims show up, it's not the city of the 6th century. Now, having said that, I think we can turn and understand better the Islamic conquests when it comes to Beirut. But to tell that story, you really have to rely on very limited, fragmentary information, but I think you can make something out of it. I'm going to focus here primarily on one of our most important sources for understanding the Islamic conquest in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that's the work of al-Baladhuri, Futuh al-Buldan. Now, when you look at what he says about the conquest of the coast, it's pretty limited, but he says he places the conquest of the coastal towns between Tyre and Tartus after the takeover of Damascus in 636. Now, according to al-Baladhuri, once Damascus had fallen, Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan was directed towards the coast, and so he came over with his brother Muawiyah leading the vanguard of the army, and basically they conquered, as you see here from the quote, Saida, Arqa, Jubail, wa Beirut. Now, this is all what Baladhuri really says about the event, and that's what we have to work with. It is noteworthy that he says فتحها فتحا يسيرا, it was an easy conquest. And one could argue that this is just a random statement kind of alluding to the success of the Muslim armies. But most probably, especially when you compare it with how he describes the conquest of other cities like Latakia or Tripoli or Caesarea, where he notes the presence of fortifications and mentions the need for a siege, you know that most probably Beirut at that point didn't really have standing walls or fortifications, or at least weren't really functional. But Abbaladhuri is really not interested in telling us any more details. There's no details about the number of soldiers, which way they came, etc. Did they come over from the south, north, or north-south? None of the logistics of that. Now, typically what used to happen next as Muslim armies moved across the Near East is that they followed up well-established late antique diplomatic customs. Whenever a city would surrender, they would basically kind of have some kind of negotiated surrender agreement where a commander drew up kind of an agreement that suited maybe the circumstances of the city, and that would have been signed by a representative of the city, maybe a bishop, a patrician, or something. And the Muslim sources preserve examples from other surrender agreements that usually scholars agree reflect something authentic in kind of what happened or representative of what happened on the ground. And what I've listed here is the example given for the surrender of Baalbek, because I figured that would be more interesting to the audience. And as you note here, it's basically a very basic exchange of surrender for security and kind of jizya payment with kind of maybe some additions kind of that fit the needs of a town. So for example, here with the case of Baalbek, you see it's referring to the pasture lands and rights of pasture in the city. And kind of what's remarkable, it does mention the Greek and the Persian and the Arab population of Baalbek. And by the way, the Persians is most probably kind of the Asawira, the kind of the Persian cavalrymen left over from the Sasanian conquest. So chances are, when Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan showed up in Beirut, he would have maybe kind of had a surrender agreement with the locals. It would have been handled by either a local bishop or a patrician family. Now, obviously, we all know that during these periods of warfare, local populations will flee. And that would have happened in Beirut. But there's also the practice among these empires to actually deport some of the local populations that would have been seen as dangerous. And this is where this expression here, وَجَلَى كَثِيرًا مِنْ أَهْلِهَا. So, and the kathiran here is the key, it's the maf'ul bihi. In any case, that does mean that in the immediate aftermath, there would have been a slight demographic change where some people would have fled and left behind properties and houses. But that does not mean that this was a wholesale emptying of the city. Some people would have stayed, especially those who did not have the means to flee, as we all know, or those who had nowhere to go to. So I want to balance that and acknowledge that, but at the same time, make sure that we all know that there was also a continuity in the landscape, whether it's the urban or the manufacturing landscape. And this shows up, and I wanted to just give a couple of examples of continuity because these are the ones I'm more connected to. So for example, what you have here, kind of when you the map with the picture of the Roman bathhouse. So this is the bathhouse that was excavated opposite the Umari Mosque. And so that was a bathhouse that started in the Hellenistic period and continued to be in use all the way into the Islamic period, definitely in the Umayyad period. So you see that there is a continuity of usage throughout. The other thing that I like to mention is that there is this tendency, for example, in the studies of the Islamic period, is to immediately kind of assume that wine production and wine consumption has immediately stopped. The thing is, this is kind of a really old-fashioned view and doesn't acknowledge the continuity of the presence of a Christian population that is still producing and consuming wine. And so, yes, the amphora, the so-called Beirut amphora, does throughout the 6th century and 7th century reduces in size, but it continues to be produced until 640, 650 CE, at least, according to Paul Reynolds, the ceramic expert. Although I am kind of like wondering whether these cutoff dates are also kind of the product of assumptions. And one also should remember that amphoras are for export and that wine could be still be produced and consumed locally and transported in different vessels. So maybe there is a kind of a continuity here. Now, on the other hand, there is a change, and you see in the sources, if you look at Baladuri and others kind of more closely, the emergence of a Muslim presence in Beirut and in other towns. Now, after the initial conquest, the surrender agreement is signed. Usually what Baladuri tells us that the Muslim did is that they would leave a contingent in each town to secure its surrender and to make sure they're not rebelling or whatever. And it looks like these troops were housed in forts and watchtowers, which were rebuilt during kind of Umar's caliphate. And so this is kind of the situation between 636, 644, where there's a temporary military presence. But then, given how limited the number of troops left behind, it looks like the Byzantines were able to come back and retake the coast during the transition from the caliphate of Umar to Uthman. And so there is a reconquest of the coast by the Byzantines. Then Muawiyah has to reconquer it again. And basically, he kind of learns his lesson that these towns really have to be fortified. So he refortifies the towns in 644, 655. He moves some of the inhabitants from Baalbek and the Biqa', the Persians and the Asawira, etc., and some of the Jewish communities too, and he puts them on the coast. And he starts building a navy. Now, those people that were moved are then given allotments, and they are settled in the cities. And so this is where you see the shift from a temporary military presence to a more permanent mix of civilian and military presence in Beirut. Now, having these soldiers kind of serving in these frontier cities, including Beirut, required a command structure. And so the command structure that's created early on is kind of the creation of this position of an Emir al-Sahel. And during certain parts of Beirut's history, the Emir Sahel would actually reside in Beirut, especially the Emir Sahel, obviously, that serves the district of Damascus. Now, I want to kind of point out that Emir Sahel is different from a city governor. There would be a city governor, a wali for Beirut, and then you have the Emir Sahel. So Emir Sahel is responsible for the command of the infantry and the cavalry, and obviously kind of giving them their pay, etc. He's not responsible for anything else. He's leading them in battle. And so our sources preserves the names of some of these Umara al-Sahel, and this comes out of Tarikh Madinat Dimashq by Ibn Asakir, where there's at least 3 that I found that resided in Beirut specifically, and that's Abdurrahman ibn Sulaym al-Kalbi and Atiyya ibn Ma'bad al-Darani and his brother Thabit ibn Ma'bad al-Darani. Now, other administrative changes also take hold in Beirut and throughout the coast. Now, this issue, by the way, of the administrative organization of the new Islamic empire and its inheritance of the Byzantine system is kind of a long and complicated one, and there's different opinions as to the origins of the Islamic Ajnad system, the Muslim provinces. But what I want to point out here for our purposes is the fact that the Ajnad, whatever their origin is, whether it's a Muslim creation or it has a Sasanian origin or a Byzantine origin, is that it takes into account the need for a seaboard. And that each one of the provinces, unlike the older Byzantine themes, each one of them, Dimashq, Hims, Qinasrin, Urdun, each one of them had access to the sea. And so Beirut belonged to Ard Dimashq, which is what the term is really before the word Jund Dimashq emerges, and basically served at one of its main ports. Now, what is interesting is that obviously Beirut was the head of its own district, its own kura. We don't know the limits of this kura, how far north and how far south it would have been. But what I want you to keep in mind is that places like Beit Meri, for example, that does have archaeological remains of the Byzantine period, and places that like Khan Khaldi, etc., is most probably fell within the district of Beirut. And so kind of goods and income and taxation coming from these settlements would have come to Beirut. So Beirut, as Muslims show up, gets integrated into the Islamic Empire through the presence of soldiers, of commanders, but also as the Umayyad period proper gets started with sailors and a naval command structure. And this is what I'll turn to now. The Umayyad navy starts with Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. And I argue that Beirut's involvement with this new Muslim navy starts as soon as Muawiyah starts building his fleet during the reign of Uthman. And this, as I said earlier, comes as a result, the building of that fleet is after 644 and the Byzantine retake of the coast. And so soon after, within 5 years, Muawiyah had built a navy that starts with an expedition to Cyprus. And the expedition in Cyprus is kind of not just, you don't just see it in the Islamic sources, but you actually have inscriptions that provide you for dates of when the Cyprus expedition happened. And chances are that Beirut was one of the ports used for the ships that sailed towards Cyprus. Now, the evidence around this is limited, and the one that I will list here is kind of legendary, but I have to mention it because it's a fun story. But according to Muslim Beiruti tradition, one of the participants in the expedition to Cyprus, Haram bint Milhan, one of the women that had to join the expedition, died either in Cyprus or on her way back to Beirut, and so was buried in Beirut. Now, there is also a tomb of Haram in Cyprus, but there's one in Bashura. Eventually, Haram was moved from her original place and is actually buried in Bashura. And so that kind of provides a very tenuous connection to the Cyprus expedition. But what the other element that happens is not just that you have a fleet, but you also have an administrative network that kind of grows around that. I want you kind of to imagine it like these tentacles of the empire kind of connecting the cities to each other, Beirut to Damascus, Beirut to other towns. One of these positions is the position of Amir al-Bahr, or Wali Ghazw al-Bahr, basically what becomes the admiral. And at some point, kind of this position of Wali Ghazw al-Bahr becomes important enough that it becomes a kind of stepping stone within the administrative hierarchy. Some of these Amir al-Bahrs, as we will see, will be located in Beirut. Now, just as a kind of an interlude, After basically the death of Muawiyah and towards the end of his reign, naval efforts are really reduced because the Umayyads, kind of this shift from Sufyanid to Marwanid, means that Umayyad factional warfare, the presence of the Jarajima, and then the Byzantines taking over the coast again means that, the navy is the least of their problems and you have nothing going on there. Until al-Walid ibn Abd al-Malik kind of secures the realm. And so when al-Walid accedes to the throne, he kind of re-establishes this Amir al-Bahr position, but this time around, he actually divides it up into 3 positions, with one Amir al-Bahr in Latakia, one in Beirut and Tripoli, and one in Akka. And so Ibn Asakir very nicely preserves the names of these Umara al-Bahr. The man that served in Beirut was called Abu Khurasan al-Farisi, and his brother was Sufyan al-Farisi. And they seem to be part of this seagoing family. And so he is based in Beirut with his fleet, kind of defending the eastern seaboard. This position and this tripartite division of the Amir al-Bahr into 3 towns, one of which is in Beirut, will continue under Sulaiman bin Abd al-Malik, which means that it's a possibility, and actually there are accounts in Ibn Asakir, that Abu Khurasan and his fleet would have participated in that ill-fated and almost final siege of Constantinople in the year 717. And so basically of the 1,000 ships, possibly more, possibly less, but a large number of ships that sailed towards Constantinople would have sailed out of Beirut. Now, most of you here know that there was a failed siege that really led to the destruction of a large part of the Syrian fleet. And even the overland armies suffered from hunger, etc. And so basically when Umar II took over, he dismantled that kind of tripartite organization of the fleet. We didn't have an Amir al-Bahr in Beirut anymore, and all Sufun al-Ajnad, all the boats were collected and placed in Tyre. And so this is where the role of Tyre as kind of the Dar al-Sina'a kind of starts in the history of the city. Now, what does that all mean? For me, what's important is that under Muawiyah, under Walid ibn Abd al-Malik and Sulaiman ibn Abd al-Malik, during these moments, Beirut played a role in the Umayyad navy. And this involvement required investment, not only in facilities for sailors and ships, but also in a supply of materials. You need timber, you need rope, you need anchors, you need nails, you need leather, you need foodstuffs, you need clothing and equipment. And that leads kind of to a movement of goods. But also, as we know from the Egyptian parallel, it needs taxes and levying of goods from local sources. So just like Umayyad governors would have levied some of these goods from the locals in Egypt, one could also think of a parallel situation here in Beirut. Now, there are a couple of things that do kind of bother me a little bit when it comes to the issue of, the Beirut as the port of Damascus, is the fact that the port wasn't what it used to be. And so one of the things that I would hope archaeologists working here in Lebanon is to pay some attention to the Islamic period when we're looking at sedimentary cores taken from the port to see if we can detect anything during that period. So far we've covered soldiers and sailors. And now I would like to turn to my final kind of section of the talk, and that's the scholars. Beirut wasn't just, in the early Islamic periods, a place inhabited by soldiers and sailors, but also it seems to have attracted scholars and jihad seekers, people who wanted to participate in the protection of the frontiers. And so when you look at kind of the Arabic sources, if you're talking about Ibn Asakir's Tarikh Medina Dimashq, and I kind of went through the 10,000 or so entries in that book, I was able to find 130 men and a few women, and we'll talk about that later, who are connected to Beirut. Some of them came to Beirut specifically for pious purposes. They were drawn to Beirut because of its frontier setting. And so here I give you a list of some of the men mentioned by Ibn Asakir during the Umayyad period, and who were here before the Abbasids show up. And they seem to have been drawn to the practice of ribat. Now, what is ribat? Obviously, ribat is idea that's kind of has Quranic roots. It's connected to vigilance, steadfastness, and readiness, and is mentioned at least in two places that become kind of productive for the explanation of the process of ribat. And so, as you go into the Umayyad period, this gets linked to living on the frontier. And starts having, it has both a military and a spiritual meaning, where kind of this idea of being on the frontier and practicing steadfastness is both a military protective thing, but also a spiritual one. And so this kind of practice also gets linked to a physical dimension. And actually for many people, when I talk about ribat, the first thing that comes to their minds is a structure, a building, a fortification. And that's partially because of French scholarship on the matter that really emphasized the North African ribats. And so places like these settlements and basically in Palestine, are identified as ribats, and they do have archaeological evidence of Umayyad forts that can be linked, that this fort is an Umayyad ribat mentioned by al-Maqdisi in his geography. The thing is, what is important for me here is that ribat is not just a fortification, it is a practice, and it is this practice that is connected to both the Quranic and the Hadith tradition that makes Beirut a place of ribat. And I have to put the ribat Ibn Arraq on the, so this is the ribat that's in downtown Beirut. It's obviously very late Mamluk, early Ottoman structure, and it's not a ribat in the sense it's a Sufi structure. So that's kind of the later manifestation. But, so to go back to Beirut as a place of ribat, Beirut becomes a legitimate site of ribat partially due to a report that features two companions of the Prophet that are supposed to have come and performed the ribat in Beirut. And so what we're told is that during one of his wanderings through the Islamic Empire, Salman al-Farisi visited Damascus. Everybody wanted to have him stay over. He chose a house to stay in, and he asked after his friend, where is Abu Darda? And he was told, Abu Darda is performing ribat. Where do you perform your ribat? In Beirut. So Salman picked up and went to Beirut to perform his ribat. Now, this anecdote, this story, circulates in Hadith and the Adab collections and provides the precedent and the legitimization for the practice of ribat. If you go to Beirut and stay there, you are performing your ribat. So, and usually in the hadith and the law literature, usually there is kind of if you stay for 3 days in Beirut, you have performed your ribat duty. And so there's kind of a debate, 3 days, 40 days. But basically, this serves as, is Beirut a place to perform ribat? Yes, it is. Now, obviously, Beirut is not the only place in the Muslim literature that is identified as a legitimate place of ribat, and I see in that kind of a rivalry between certain cities. So there's a rivalry between Beirut, Tyre, and Asqalan as kind of the primary places of ribat. But that ties Beirut to a sacred geography. And this is where also we see al-Awzāʿī show up. Because in a lot of the accounts of the history of Beirut, we are told that al-Awzāʿī came to Beirut first to practice ribat, to be involved in that, and just moved in. And while that might have been a factor, I want to kind of nuance that a little bit within kind of the context of what's happening in the Muslim empire. But before moving to that, I have to acknowledge that the arrival of al-Awzāʿī in Beirut was good for Beirut on many levels, because it brought it back into partially the historical limelight. Muslim sources become a bit more interested in Beirut as a result of his presence. And so it makes our job as historians kind of easier. So I don't want to assume everybody knows who al-Awzāʿī is. So just kind of to make some connections, al-Awzāʿī was born in the Biqa', either in Karaknuh or Baalbek. The sources are kind of not sure. I believe it's Karaknuh because he does have a friend there that he visits occasionally, according to the sources. And he's born there around the year 88, which is 707, during kind of a stable period of the Umayyad Empire. He was fatherless, raised by his mother, and kind of moved around, and then he enrolls in the Diwan, meaning he joins the military. And he is sent on an expedition to fight the Kharijites in Yamama. And it's there that he gets drawn into the study of hadith and fiqh. He leaves the army and goes on kind of a study kind of years. And he goes to Basra, studies with Ibn Sirin, and eventually returns to Damascus. And so he becomes a leading jurist within the court of Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik. And so he lives in Damascus between 10 to 15 years. The move of al-Awzāʿī from Damascus to Beirut happens, though, during a period referred to as Ayyam Zamal. We are here during the period of Marwan II, the last days, basically, of the Umayyad Empire. He has this governor of Damascus called Zamal ibn Amr. And he's really going after anyone who was against Marwan II. He actually he murders some scholars. And one of them, Umayr ibn Hani, who was known as an ascetic and a Qadarite, actually is murdered, and his head is paraded in the Umayyad mosque. You can imagine the effect that would have on other scholars, especially those associated with the Umayyads. We are told in Ibn Asakir's Tarikh Madinat Dimashq that al-Awzāʿī hides in Mount Lebanon and eventually finds his way to Beirut. At that point, the Umayyads are gone, the Abbasids have shown up, and they are not friendly with the Umayyads and their courtiers either. And so al-Awzāʿī turns Beirut into his home. Once in Beirut, al-Awzāʿī lived in this town for at least 25 years. He taught here, he raised a family here, and built a reputation as a scholar and as a pious man here. Like much of his life, what we know about him comes from anecdotes, stories, hagiographical fragments, but these can be used to kind of have an idea of what was going on in Beirut at the time, kind of remember the people who lived there. First, al-Awzāʿī was married. We think his wife was called Juwayriyah. They had 3 daughters who got married in Beirut to Beiruti men and had children here. And most probably there may be some people here who are descendants of al-Awzāʿī. He had a son, however, his son died childless, and that's why he gets identified as one of the Abdal. We can talk about that another time. So that gives us a window into Beirut. It's not just soldiers, scholars, and sailors. It's families, regular people who lived here and built a life. There is an archaeology to be found of the Islamic period. There's also stories around al-Awzāʿī. So I've just put 2 here, just to kind of give you an idea. We forget that Beirut is a fishing town. And you have a story here of a Beiruti fisherman who was so impious he wouldn't go to Jum'ah prayer until eventually divine wrath got him. And he fell in a sinkhole, him and his donkey. And that sinkhole becomes a place where al-Awzāʿī students go and it's like, look at what happened here. Al-Awzāʿī passes by the mosque and he sees an onion seller and a sweet seller. And the onion seller is saying, my onions are better than these sweets, they're sweeter. And here you have like this kind of window into, you know, the regular people. I don't want to say the regular Joe, maybe the regular Muhammad or something. Al-Awzāʿī also gives us a window into the life of Beirut through his letters that survive in the Taqdimat al-Jarh wa-Ta'dil by Ibn Abi Hatim al-Razi. Here, and sorry, it's not, well, actually it's not bad, it's kind of clear. Al-Awzāʿī writes a letter to al-Mansur advocating for the local soldiers. And what he's doing here is trying to get them more money. And he points out to al-Mansur is that the life of a soldier in Beirut is not an easy one. You have to live in the forts in the summer, in the heat, while your family is in town. And during the winter, you have to endure the rain and the cold. And you're being paid 10 dinars a year. And 10 dinars is really not enough to raise a family. The same goes for the widows and the orphans that are receiving that pay. So it kind of, first of all, this document is really important because it actually gives us the pay of how much a regular soldier was being paid in the early Abbasid period. But also it gives you a window into the life in Beirut. Now, another result of al-Awzāʿī's long residence in Beirut was the formation of a circle of students around him in Beirut itself, who preserved and transmitted his teaching, ensuring that his legacy remained alive in the city. During his lifetime, a small group of about 6 close disciples gathered around him and accompanied him through his life, studying with him, debating with him, being around him in the mosque all the time. Now, interestingly, 5 of these 6 were from outside Beirut, and they seem to have arrived during that same period of kind of turmoil at the end of the Umayyad period, and one of them only seems to have been Beirut-born, let's say. Now, these students become the first generation of transmitters of al-Awzāʿī's ideas, and it continues with their children and their grandchildren. And so it becomes almost like a family affair that grows around Awzāʿī and preserves his legacy in town. And so both Awzāʿī and these students of his start drawing in visitors, scholars interested in learning from al-Awzāʿī. And I'm not going to bore you with all the different names, but I will mention only one that should be kind of familiar to most of you here, and that's the famous historian, al-Tabari. Al-Tabari came to Beirut, stayed 9 nights. It seems he slept in the mosque, and read the Quran to al-Abbas ibn Walid ibn Umayyad, who was the 2nd generation student of al-Awzāʿī. In addition to doing this, he received from al-Abbas al-Awzāʿī's legal responsa, and this is where he basically then puts them in his book, Kitab Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha. And if you were to open it and look inside, you'll see that in the chain of transmission, you'll have al-Walid and al-Abbas, because al-Abbas was taking from his father. Now, thanks to this densely populated biographical literature and kind of almost the obsessive anecdote collection of medieval Muslim scholars, we catch fleeting glimpses of Beirut. Whether it's in al-Awzāʿī's times, we have the fisherman, the onion seller, the Coptic